You guys gonna sit down back there, or what's going on? So we were at TEDx yesterday, and this guy's clicker wouldn't work, and he stood there forever. Didn't say a word. It was crazy. Wasn't it cool? Yeah. Jill was freaking out. She's grabbing me. She's grabbing the guy next to her. She's like, what's happening? What's happening? It was funny. Yeah. And after like 3 minutes of silence, he goes, it's good so far, isn't it? It was cool. All right, so it's time to do an Old Testament study. We always go back and forth between the Old Testament and the New Testament because one of the really important objects of the game for us here is to build continuity between the two testaments. And so the writers of the New Testament, and often the people that they were writing to, used Old Testament references, and they understood the Old Testament references in a way that we don't even come close to. Okay, so we would like here to make an effort to kind of close that gap a little bit. And so that's why we go back and forth this way. And, you know, it's getting a little crowded around here. I apparently haven't said anything in a while that makes a bunch of people decide to leave. So maybe it's time to cull the herd a little bit. So we're going to spend some time in Leviticus, right? If I have not managed to offend you yet, then maybe the Levitical law will. All right, so I'm just kidding, kind of. No Levitical law, all right? But we are actually going to be in Leviticus. We're going to start out in chapter 23, and then we're going to kind of head all over the Bible from there. And so we're going to be constantly referring back to the chapter 23 of Leviticus. And, you know, we're kind of completely going off the rails here. Most of the teachings that I do are based on studies and subjects and teachings that someone I trust has put the bulk of the work into. I'm not a scholar, right? You probably guessed that already. But there are scholars that I trust. So the vast majority of the things that I say to you on Sundays are things that I heard someone else say. Okay, that's the way this works usually. This one here, right? This is completely from scratch. And I think that that's mostly because no one wants to talk about what we're going to talk about. Or maybe it's because it's completely crazy. Okay? So I'm not saying that I'm not gathering information from other people that have already researched and verified the information I am, and that's what's going on. But what I am saying is that I've never really heard or come across anyone teaching what we're going to teach here over the next couple of weeks, especially at church. So there are just cultural biases and doctrinal biases of, that they kind of compound over time. And there are historical circumstances that change the emphasis of religious observances. There's the sinful nature of man that insists that he's right and will defend his position at any cost. And all of these things kind of come together to create this weird blind spot on this issue, I think. And I don't really have a specific explanation for why we don't talk about this. All right, but we're going to study the Old Testament Jewish feasts or festivals in some depth. It's a little bit weird, all right? So many of us have been Christians for a very long time, but I would suggest that not very many of us know very much about the Jewish festival calendar. Why is that? Well, because we're not Jewish, okay? Like it's a decent reason, right? That's true, we're not Jewish. And there are things about being Jewish that we can never and will never be because most of us are Gentiles. All right, but Christianity itself is a pretty Jewish thing, okay? All of its founders and its Messiah were Jewish. The Christian scriptures are all Jewish scriptures, or they were written by Jewish men. And really, the very purpose of the national election of Israel was so that there would be this distinct group of people to bring the story to the world about how God works in history. So there are things that, God required of the Jewish people in order to inform our understanding and to teach us how God works in history and what God's plan for history looks like. All right, so today's mostly going to be background information and laying the groundwork so that we can understand the rest of this study. And there's a lot more to learn before we get started, really, even than I ever imagined. And I would think that you've got a few questions right about now, right? Like, what's a festival anyway? Okay, so we don't really have festivals. I don't think, maybe we just call them something else. But a festival sounds a little bit like a party. And so maybe this whole thing's going to be fun that we're talking about. Maybe not. We're going to define that word. We're going to try and figure out why they translated it that way. We're also going to try and work out which of the Old Testament festivals we're even talking about. Okay, there are a lot of things that pop up if you Google Jewish calendar. All right, we're going to whittle that down some. We are also going to have to go through the differences in the way that the Jewish people reckon dates and time from the way that we reckon dates and time. It can get ridiculously confusing. And believe it or not, we may add to what you know about the word Sabbath. There's more of them on the calendar than just one in every 7 days. And so when the writers of Scripture reference the Sabbath, we kind of need to know what they might be talking about. All right, so this little talk today doesn't sound at all like church, and you're not Jewish and you don't like sitting in history class or language class or astronomy. This sounds kind of boring, all right? Sounds like it's not going to make me feel any better about God or myself or my marriage or whatever. I tried to tell you I'm trying to get rid of some of you, okay? Just kidding, kind of. If the object of the game in studying both the Old Testament and the New Testament is to bring them together and demonstrate that God has a plan for the history of the world and that he's been working the same plan from the beginning, then this subject does that for me as much or more than any other subject we have ever studied. All right, so if you'll stay with me through this, I think that by the end, you're going to be like mesmerized and amazed and excited about the way that God works in history. And I'll totally grant that most of the time when I'm super excited about a weird subject, y'all just kind of sit there and humor me. Okay, and so after just one Sunday of the Mysterion of God or the Daniel prophecies or Melchizedek or, the things that Jesus said from the cross, we generally get back to the stuff that isn't too painful to try and understand what it even means, okay? But hold on tight. This is going to be like 8 or 9 weeks of that stuff, and Melchizedek is the only one that I'm not planning on bringing into this. Okay, so I might be able to work him in. We'll see. So half the room is sitting there right now like, WTF, dude, what is he talking about? It doesn't matter. Skip that part if you don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, I'm excited, and I know for sure that you're not, okay? Which kind of tickles me a little bit and makes me a little bit more excited, but I really do think that this is really good stuff. All right, so let's do it. The word festival, all right, it's a funny one to use here, okay? So these things are also commonly referred to as feasts, which is even funnier, okay? In English, a festival is like a celebration. And the only good thing about using this word is that a festival is usually something that happens every year, right? Like the Iowa State Pumpkin Festival or something like that. These things from the Old Testament are not all celebratory, okay? Some of them are pretty somber. So if you want to really understand what we're talking about, festival's not a very good word for us to use about this stuff. So these things are things that come around every year, but you should definitely not expect all of them to be presented as happy celebratory times. So the word that the Old Testament uses here is, I said, also often translated as feast. And so what's the first thing that comes to your mind if I say feast? It's a lot of food, right? Like that's what you're talking about. Well, one of these feasts has a meal associated with it. One of them is entirely about fasting, and one of them is mostly characterized by the things that you cannot eat. Okay, so does that sound like feasts to you? No, like Thanksgiving is a feast. Feast is another very insufficient translation of the intended meaning here. And so just because someone translated this as feast, and so that's the word we use for it, does not at all mean that you would even get fed during one of these feasts. Okay, so the actual Hebrew word here is moedim. And so now that that's all cleared up, we'll just move on. I'm just kidding, again. All right, so it translates most literally to appointed time. All right, so that's what we're going to be studying for the next weeks, is the times appointed by God. And these are times that God described for the Hebrew people to have appointments with him. But I also believe that we're going to demonstrate that these are appointments that we can have with God. And I also intend to show, and it sure looks like, these are promised appointments that Jesus intends to keep with us. All right, and I'll show what I mean by that later, maybe not even today. So generally, these are best thought of as appointed times, not feasts or festivals, okay? Dumb words, don't use them. Well, I mean, use them, but know what you mean, all right? So are we really gonna go through the whole Jewish calendar? Have you guys ever looked at the Jewish calendar? There's a lot of stuff on there, right? And you've probably heard of some of it. You probably even know what some of it means, or at least how it's observed, right? Like, we have Jewish friends, kinda. So we're not gonna do the whole thing, okay? Not even close. And you're not supposed to be able to read that, okay? So don't worry about that. But this is a very standard example of a list of the Jewish holidays that you're gonna find online. But to say that something is Jewish is very different than saying something is Christian, right? To be Jewish could mean that you're talking about a religion or an ethnicity or a nation. And so maybe you're talking about all of those things, and maybe you're only talking about one. And so we are very specifically here talking about the times that God set aside in the Old Testament. And that means that we're going to be talking about what would exist today as the religion of Judaism. But we're kind of talking about an older version of the religion than what we usually encounter today, because some of the things have been dropped. And some of them have been kind of mixed together. And some of them have been supplanted by national holidays. And sometimes for good reasons, and sometimes for really dumb reasons. But my point is that the religious days and the national holidays are all mixed together. And some of the things on this list are things that we're going to talk about. And some of them are national holidays, like our 4th of July or Thanksgiving, all right? And so those things are not going to make our list of things that we're going to talk about. We're basically going to be talking about these 4. And we select these 4 for one very important reason. The rest of these just don't make the list. The holidays that we won't talk about may very well be very important times. They may be God-honoring times, but they are not times that God himself put on this list, okay? And that makes all the difference for what we're talking about. We're also going to talk about 3 additional times that used to be on this list, okay? But for various reasons, they aren't anymore. And so we're going to switch out Rosh Hashanah for the Feast of Trumpets right in this spot. And we're going to squeeze the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Festival of First Fruits right in here next to Passover. All right. We're also going to point out and change the fact that this list starts in the wrong spot. The Jewish Civil New Year starts with Tishri 1. That's usually in September, and that's where this list starts. The Jewish Religious New Year starts on Nisan 1. That's in March or April. And that would make the list start right about here. And so I suspect that you're starting to get the sense that you completely understand why nobody ever talks about this. It's a little bit crazy. But if you sit here for 5 more minutes, you're going to know for sure why nobody talks about this. It's impossible to keep it straight, okay? And your brain can't really figure out why it would even try to keep it straight. But if you make it through today, and maybe next week, I'm pretty sure that you're going to start to be excited. So this stuff will start to fall into place. But this calendar, starting in the wrong spot, brings us to the place where it's time to talk about the way that the Hebrew people reckon times and dates. So since we're already talking about the calendar, we're going to stick with that for now. We're going to do time afterwards. Our calendar is called the Gregorian calendar. It's been the standard calendar for much of the Western world since 1582, when the world had had all it could take of the Julian calendar of the Romans, which had each year being 11 minutes too long. All right, so that may not be a big deal for you or for me, but if you're the Catholic Church trying to calculate when Easter is based on when the equinox in March is, and the calendar's drifting 3 days every 400 years, then eventually you have to do something about it. All right, so we have the unimaginably huge reform of eliminating 3 leap years from happening every 400 years. Whatever. All right, so this is an example of what a month on our calendar looks like. I hope you're all at least casually acquainted with what you're looking at. All right, you have to be more familiar with it than I am. I hate calendars. But anyway, this is a good representation of the way that we think about time. Okay, it's a pretty linear flow, moves from one day to the next, and then from 1 month to the next, and so on. All right, so I'm not saying that Jewish people can't or don't use calendars just like we do, but if you do a Google image search of Jewish calendars, most of them are round. And the image that's up there is a standard 1-year Hebrew calendar. And this is just an example of how their language and their framework of time is just a little bit different than ours. And where ours is kind of a linear flow like a river or a number line, theirs is more of a helix shape that spins even as it does move in a direction. All right, so our Gregorian calendar is essentially a solar calendar. It's primarily based on how long it takes for the Earth to make 1 revolution of the sun. And that answer to that question is 365.2425 days. Okay, so our calendar is pretty convoluted, but it seems normal because it's our calendar. Okay, and since 1752, the British government, which we were in the middle of not paying any attention to, but we adopted this also. The British government has insisted that each new year starts on January 1st. So most of us have just that one framework that we've ever viewed the question, like, what date is it? Okay, so what's the date? Well, we all agree most of the time. And each of our years has the same number of months. Right? Even if the number of days in each month is kind of a mess. Our days are each 24 hours long. Our hours are 60 minutes long. And each new day starts at midnight for us, so that we wake up each day to a new day, right? Each morning brings us a new day. And with all of its idiosyncrasies, there's still a lot of regularity to our calendar. The Jewish calendar, on the other hand, is based on the phases of the moon. So the coming of the new month had to be verified each month by 2 reliable witnesses who each saw the waxing crescent of the moon after a new moon. So this is called the head of the month, and it marks the arrival of a new month. Now, they say that the Jewish year has 12 months in it. But it takes 29 and a half days for the moon to complete a cycle. So if you multiply 29.5 times 12, you get 354 days. not 365.2524 that the solar year has. So that's 11 days off every single year. And that means that in just a couple of years, you have your fall harvest festival that you have at the end of September. All of a sudden, it's happening on July 4th, right? So it doesn't take long for that to be an absolute mess. And so to fix that problem, every 2 or 3 years, they insert an extra month at the end of the year. It's after the month of Adar, so it's called Second Adar. And so, like, this compensation for the solar seasons technically makes the Jewish calendar a solar-lunar hybrid calendar, not a purely lunar calendar. Like, some cultures have had purely lunar calendars. So you'll also see in the Bible that the hours of the day are called third hour, sixth hour, whatever, something like that. I'm sure you also know that they didn't have wristwatches or smartphones. So, however much daylight they had, even if it was 15 hours, got divided into 12 pieces and called hours, but not in English, right? They hour in Hebrew or whatever. All right, and so that means that hour 1 was the first hour after sunrise, and it might be 45 minutes long, and it might be 75 minutes long. And each hour was counted that way. So each day had slightly different lengths of hours, but all the days had the same number of hours. Following? Fun. All right. So then there's this issue that each day starts in a different place than ours does. And so you probably already understand this, but it gets kind of important as we're working out some of the points that I want to make in the coming weeks. And so I am quite the graphic artist. So this little diagram is going to help clear things up. All right. So this is how our days and dates work. Again, this is something you're already supposed to be familiar with. All right. Our days start at midnight, and we start counting hours at that point until we get to 12, when we start over counting hours at noon. But it's still the same day, okay? We wake up each morning to a new day. But because in the creation account, God marks each day with the statement, and there was evening and there was morning, when God says that, he says evening first. So the Hebrew day starts with sunset. Their day starts in a different place than ours, and it starts when 2 reliable witnesses each see 3 stars. It's a new day. So the first meal of their day is the last meal before they go to bed. And they wake up each morning to the same day that they went to bed to. And they start counting the hours of the day with sunrise. So it's a little bit weird, but it's not terribly confusing until you start to apply our calendar and our thinking to their way of reckoning times and days. So if God says that the Feast of Tabernacles is supposed to begin on the 15th day of the month of Tishri, and we wanted to figure out when to do that, we'd start by lining up the calendars. 15th day of Tishri for this last year was September 20th. So the Feast of Tabernacles begins on September 20th, right? No, the 15th day of Tishri and September 20th are only the same day for part of the day, because the 2 dates start at different times of the day, right? So the 15th day of Tishri actually starts on September 19th. And the Feast of Tabernacles ended on September 27th this last year. So when the sun went down on that day, and 2 reliable witnesses saw 3 stars each, the day was over, and so was the festival. All right, so there's that little detail and that difference that you need to be aware of, because it's going to be a factor in some of the things that we're going to point out. Last thing that we need to talk about with regard to time is the way that each year starts. All right, so every year on December 31st, one year ends and another begins on January 1st. We consider that date to be the start of our civil calendar, our social calendar, just about every other kind of calendar. And so the only real calendar that we even understand to have a different starting and ending time is the idea of the fiscal year. So many businesses and corporate entities designate a different date from December 31st for their fiscal year to end. And so that's various tax and income reasons. And we kind of get that, right? Like we kind of understand what's happening. A bunch of you probably know this one. So what's the Hebrew name for the holiday that we generally know of as Jewish New Year, right? Anybody? Good guess. No. There you go. Rosh Hashanah. All right, so that's right. Anybody know when it is? All right, September-ish. Okay, so this year it was September 7th and 8th. Next year it's going to be the 26th and the 27th. On the round calendar, it's the first day of the month of Tishri. So this is pretty much their equivalent of our New Year's Day. It starts the civil year. It starts the year for figuring out the agricultural tithe. It falls supposedly directly on the equinox day that marks the end of summer and the beginning of autumn. It's called the New Year of the Seasons. But there are actually 4 different New Years in Hebrew thinking. And 2 of them have kind of dropped out of the mind of even most Jewish people, but not all of them. There's one other New Year's Day that's still very prominent in Jewish culture, and especially in Judaism. So here's your round calendar again. You can see that the month of Tishri that we just talked about is at the bottom, just to the left of center, and it has a little 7 on it. Maybe you can see that. So the month that starts their civil year is the 7th month in their religious year. And as I said at the beginning of this incredibly engaging little rap, the religious year starts with the month of Nisan. And so the first day of the month of Nisan is the first day of the year, according to God, for the Jewish people. And so when God is talking to Moses and Aaron and describing what he wants the Jewish people to do in preparation for the Passover plague in Egypt, he says, this month is to be for you the first month of your year. And so God establishes the start of a timeline that repeats every year. And the message that he's sending only makes sense if you start in this place. And so the religion of Judaism totally understood this, and it still understands this. So the round calendars all start with the month of Nisan. But because being Jewish has no real relation at this point in time to whether or not a person is observing Judaism, right? It's actually a little funny and a little sad that you can have this situation where there are still many of God's ordained and prescribed festivals on this list of Jewish holidays, but almost half of them have been abandoned or absorbed or reimagined as secular or national holidays, and the ones that are left aren't even in the right order for them to make any sense. All right, so you have to celebrate the new year right there where that green line is for anything that God was trying to communicate to fall into place. So that's how we're going to lay these feasts out. We're going to start where God tells us to start, and we're going to let the pieces fall into place. Next topic. I thought we'd never get done with time, right? All right, so what's a Sabbath? Seems like a silly question, but there's actually a little bit to talk about here. So we have names for days of the week, right? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you know what I'm talking about. The Jewish people actually did not. They just numbered them, okay? First day, second day, sixth day, whatever. I'm sure that most of you are aware that God rested on the 7th day of creation. And so it says that by the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy because on it, He rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So that's the way that the second chapter of Genesis starts. And then later, when God is giving Moses 10 special rules, he prescribed that the Jewish people would do the very same thing every seventh day. This is commandment number 4 from Exodus 20. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." So what God means by Sabbath is starting to take shape here. The seventh day does not have a new name, okay? It's still the seventh day, but it's described and it's set apart as a special day of observance to the Lord your God. So Sabbath is not a day of the week, like Saturday or Sunday, okay? It's a day of religious observance and abstinence from work. All right, so there is one every seventh day. Seventh day is Saturday for us. That's the one that commemorates God's work of creation, and it mimics his rhythm of working and then like contemplating and fellowshipping. And he's resting in satisfaction, not in exhaustion. Okay, he rests. And no doubt this is most likely put in place for our good. But God calls the people to observe other Sabbaths as well. So there are days set aside for religious observance and abstinence from work that have nothing to do with which day of the week they fall on. And it should be slightly interesting to us, because this is different than what we would do, that these other prescribed Sabbath days never make it so that the Jewish people do not also have to observe the seventh day Sabbath. So these special Sabbath days are in addition to weekly Sabbaths. All right, and so these are often referred to as the high Sabbaths. They will almost always make it so that there's more than one Sabbath in a week. And just so that I'm 100% sure that I've made my point, Sabbath is not a day of the week. All right, it's a day of prescribed rest and religious observance. So this is a passage from the text in Leviticus that we're going to read in just a minute. It's talking about a festival that lasts for 7 days, and it starts on the 15th day of the month. And that means that there's only a 1 in 7 chance that the day that this is talking about will fall on a regular weekly Sabbath. And it says on the first day of the festival, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. That's the definition of a Sabbath. Okay? So is everybody with me? Want me to say it again? All right, so we're going to finish up by talking about why we're going to study this, but first I'm going to read straight through the text. This is Leviticus 23, the whole chapter. All right, so settle in for a second, try and follow along. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, these are my appointed festivals, the appointed festivals of the Lord, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies. There are 6 days when you may work, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest, a day of sacred assembly. You're not to do any work. Wherever you live, it's a Sabbath to the Lord. These are the Lord's appointed festivals. The sacred assemblies you're to proclaim at their appointed times. The Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. On the 15th day of that month, the Lord's festival of unleavened bread begins. For 7 days you must eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. For 7 days, present a food offering to the Lord. And on the seventh day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you and you reap its harvest, bring to the priests a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. He is to wave the sheaf before the Lord so that it will be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath. On the day you wave the sheaf, You must sacrifice as a burnt offering to the Lord a lamb a year old without defect, together with its grain offering of 2/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with olive oil, a food offering presented to the Lord, a pleasing aroma, and its drink offering of 1/4 of a hin of wine. You must not eat any bread or roasted or new grain until the very day you bring the offering to your God. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, wherever you live. From the day after the Sabbath, the day you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, count off 7 full weeks. Count off 50 days up to the day after the 7th Sabbath, and then present an offering of new grain to the Lord. From wherever you live, bring 2 loaves made of 2/10 of an ephah of the finest flour baked with yeast as a wave offering of first fruits to the Lord. Present with this bread 7 male lambs, each a year old and without defect, 1 young bull and 2 rams. They will be a burnt offering to the Lord, together with their grain offerings and drink offerings, a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. Then sacrifice 1 male goat for a sin offering and 2 lambs, each a year old, for a fellowship offering. The priest is to wave the 2 lambs before the Lord as a wave offering, together with the bread of the first fruits. They are a sacred offering to the Lord for the priest. On that same day you are to proclaim a sacred assembly and do no work. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, wherever you live. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. I'm the Lord your God. The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, on the first day of the 7th month that you're to have a day of Sabbath rest, a sacred assembly commemorated with trumpet blasts. Do no regular work, but present a food offering to the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, the 10th day of this 7th month is the Day of Atonement. Hold a sacred assembly and deny yourselves and present a food offering to the Lord. Do not do any work on that day, because it's the Day of Atonement, when atonement is made for you before the Lord your God. Those who do not deny themselves on that day must be cut off from their people. I will destroy from among their people anyone who does any work on that day. You shall do no work at all. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, wherever you live. It is a day of Sabbath rest for you, and you must deny yourselves. From the evening of the 9th day of the month until the following evening, you are to observe your Sabbath. The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, on the 15th day of the 7th month, the Lord's festival of tabernacles begins, and it lasts for 7 days. The first day is a sacred assembly. Do no regular work. For 7 days, present food offerings to the Lord, and on the 8th day, hold a sacred assembly and present a food offering to the Lord. It is the closing special assembly. Do no regular work. These are the Lord's appointed festivals, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies for bringing food offerings to the Lord, the burnt offerings and grain offerings, sacrifices and drink offerings required for each day. These offerings are in addition to those for the Lord's Sabbath, and in addition to your gifts and whatever you have vowed, and all of the free will offerings you give to the Lord. So beginning with the 15th day of the 7th month, after you've gathered the crops of your land, celebrate the festival to the Lord for 7 days. The first day is a day of Sabbath rest, and the 8th day also is a day of Sabbath rest. On the first day, you're to take branches from luxuriant trees, from palms, willows, and other leafy trees, and rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. Celebrate this as a festival to the Lord for 7 days each year. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. Celebrate it in the 7th month. Live in temporary shelters for 7 days. All native-born Israelites are to live in such shelters, so your descendants will know that I have the Israelites live in temporary shelters when I brought them out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So Moses announced to the Israelites the appointed festivals of the Lord. Whew. I'm glad we don't have to do it all at once ever again. But we're going to run back through some parts of this, and we're going to point out just what God said and what this passage institutes, establishes, and reiterates. So the first thing I want to make really clear, and is one of the reasons why we're doing this, is that we think of these rituals and observances that the Jewish people have done for centuries as Jewish holidays or Jewish festivals or Old Testament observances. But these are God's festivals. All right, these are God's appointed times or appointments with God. And while it is completely true that it was the Jewish people that were commanded to observe these things and not us, that does not mean that we can overlook the details of what these appointments teach. All right, it may be that there could be some benefit to actually observing some of these appointments in order to experientially learn the things that God was trying to give the Hebrews the opportunities to learn. Okay, and so then God reiterates the weekly Sabbath. He puts it right here in this list with all of these high Sabbaths and other appointments. It is slightly set apart in the text. It does seem deliberately put first. Traditionally, rabbis and sages have interpreted the weekly Sabbath to be the most important of all of these appointments. Okay, maybe it is. But because it's set apart and already firmly established, it actually doesn't count as one of the festivals of the Lord that this passage establishes and kind of sets in motion. Okay, and so then God says that he's about to tell them what festivals are the ones that he's laying out for them apart from the weekly Sabbath. So you see the colon there after where it says appointed times. So the list of appointments comes next. Jumps right into it. First appointment of the year, right? Passover commemoration has already been described in detail by God, and so he does not do that here. That's what we're going to do next week. But he does say what's supposed to happen and when it's supposed to happen. So this is the first month that God established, right? Not the one for their civil New Year. So we're talking about the 14th day of the month of Nisan. We're not going to go into any of the details today because, again, we have to have something to talk about next week. And, geez, this is getting long. But, you know, God says that the appointment starts at twilight. And you can't really tell in English, but that's not the same as evening. Okay, this one's late afternoon. This is the only one of God's appointments that doesn't start with a new day. It starts when the 14th day is almost over. And it actually ends at midnight of that same day by our way of reckoning things, okay? But again, we're going to work that out next week. Then on the very next day, for us, it would be just a couple of hours later, okay, in the same day, God names another appointment. Festival of Unleavened Bread starts when the sun goes down on the same day that the people are eating their Passover meal, all right, and it lasts for 7 days. So we have our second of the appointments with God put on the calendar, and this one begins and ends with one of those high Sabbaths that we were talking about. These are observed Sabbath days that do not fall on the weekly Sabbath. All right, and so God doesn't seem to give this next appointment a proper name, but he does tell them what to do. All right, he says to bring to the priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. And then the priest would wave the sheaf before the Lord on the day after Sabbath. And while this all seems very unclear to me about which Sabbath and all of that we're talking about, it was not unclear to the Jewish people. So they interpreted this to mean the day after the weekly Sabbath immediately following Passover. And that makes it happen during the 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And it just so happens that this works out really well for the first barley crop to be what they generally brought. And so God may not have named this feast himself or festival, but when he told them what to bring, it kind of named itself. All right, so this is the festival of first fruits. We have another one that God does not name, but he tells them what to do and when. You start counting from the festival of first fruits, and you count 7 full days plus a day, 7 full weeks plus a day. That's 50 days. So you're on another day after the weekly Sabbath. okay? And you present an offering of new grain to the Lord. You're basically doing the same thing as in the last appointment, but with different grain this time. Wheat is planted later than barley, takes longer to mature, so this is when they brought the first of the wheat harvest to the temple. It was offered to God. So we already have a festival called First Fruits, so they started looking around for a name to name this one, and because of the weeks that they had to count to get to it, they named it the Feast of Weeks, okay? So on the Feast of Weeks, which has nothing to do with food and only takes one day, we have another high Sabbath. So this one can never be on the weekly Sabbath again, because it's always the day after a weekly Sabbath. All right, and we're finally out of the month of Nisan. So now we're in the month of Sivan. This is the third month, which is the end of May, early June kind of thing. Next appointment jumps to the seventh month, which they call Tishri. This is the neighborhood of like September and October. This is the only one of God's appointments that starts on the first day of a new month. So that's going to be significant when we get to talking about that one. Also a high Sabbath, and it's a day where you do no regular work, just like the weekly Sabbath that you're going to have later the same week. God didn't name this one either, but he did say that they were to commemorate the day and the sacred assembly with trumpet blasts. So that's pretty much all he says here about this one. So this day got the name Feast of Trumpets. Again, this has nothing to do with food. It's an appointment. It's a time that God wants remembered and commemorated on this day and in this way, for some reason that may or may not have been clear to the people that he told to do this. Next appointment, it's in the same month, Tishri, on the 10th day. And God names this one, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, all right? Also a high Sabbath. And where it says to deny yourselves has been pretty universally accepted to mean that this is a day of fasting. Way more details on this one, even in this text, but we're going to get to those when we get to this study. Lastly, we have this one here that starts on the 15th day of that same month. Tishri lasts for 7 days. God names this last one, right? Feast of Tabernacles. And this one includes 2 of those high Sabbaths that we've been pointing out, right? One on the first day, one on the last day after it ends, actually, on this one. And so these appointments that God set with the Hebrew people and what he may have been giving them the opportunity to recognize is what we're going to be studying for the next couple of months. And I know that today is super dry. May have been difficult to stay focused, especially the reading part, okay? But I think that if you can stay with me, it's going to be the most remarkable demonstration of the sovereignty of God and the omniscience of God that you've come across in a long time, all right? And so we're going to talk about the 7 festivals of the Lord that are the only ones on the Jewish calendar that God put there. And we'll also be pointing out those 7 high Sabbaths that were associated with these festivals. And so God gave the people these holidays with almost no explanation. Most of the meaning that was associated with them had to be inferred. Sometimes they got the meaning right, sometimes they didn't. But if you put them in the correct order and understand the times and lay the historical record over it, after you sift the historical record, the meanings become clear and the parallels are kind of astonishing. And so there's another thing that God gave instructions for, but never really explained. There was a 7-branched menorah that was built to be displayed and lit first inside the tabernacle. That was God's tent while the Hebrews are wandering the desert, and then inside the temple. So this picture is of a recreation done by the Temple Institute in Jerusalem. And I'm sure that to most of you, this thing looks familiar, but this is not the same as the 9-branched menorah that's used in the Hanukkah celebration. This one with 7 branches was so sacred that the Jewish people were not allowed to light any 7-branched menorah outside of the dwelling place of God. All right, the 7-branched oil lamp was so unique to the Hebrew people and so important to them that it became the very first symbol that we know of that represented the Jewish people as a nation. It's older than the Star of David, and it's the current emblem on the coat of arms of the modern state of Israel. And no one really knows why God had them make it that way. They just did what they were told. And they made it important and they made it sacred to do what they were told. All right, and so in that way, the Jewish people have accomplished their mission as God's chosen people to bring the message of redemption and reconciliation to the world. They've deliberately recreated every aspect of their instructions in every way that they could, while having no idea at all how to decide what was essential and what was superfluous, right? They have chosen incorrectly a few times over the millennia on what to emphasize and what to disregard. But here we sit with all this stuff to read and to talk about, and all these pictures of what life looks like lived as God's people. It's actually really cool, okay? And if you take this artifact that God told the Jewish people to build without telling them why, and you use it as a key or a timeline, or at the very least a mnemonic device for making sense out of the appointments that God gave the Jewish people without explaining the appointments, you start the calendar in the place that God said to start the calendar. You have the 3 feasts in the spring with the June festival in the middle, and the fall appointments all grouped together on the right. All right, and even with the names all kind of weird, and only the vaguest notion of how these things are observed and the history that would overlay these festivals, I bet that many of you can start to get a whiff that these festivals might describe God's plan for history. All right, and you can already get a sense maybe of where we currently are in this timeline, if we could be so bold as to call it that. Right? And so what I bet you're not fully aware of is just how incredibly precise and prophetic the festivals that have already been fulfilled actually are. All right, so that's what we're going to be spending our time looking at for the next several weeks. That's pretty much all I have today. And that's enough.